creative living, utilizing today's technology with the best of the past to bring you innovative ideas and up-to-date information for creative lifestyles in today's active world. With your host, Sheryl Borden.
I'm so glad you joined me today for Creative Living. We're going to learn how to quilt. We'll talk about adopting a stress-free atmosphere for cooking and show how to use a double cord presser foot on the sewing machine. One of my guests is Marcy Baker, and she's a quilter and author, and she's taught many people how to quilt. She'll talk about why we quilt and explain how each quilt tells its own story. So if anyone has tried to quilt in the past and been disappointed, Marcy says, yes, you can quilt, and with her tips, you can. Her business is Alicia's Attics in Fort Collins, Colorado. Another guest is cookbook author Maria Bernardis, and Maria will talk about how to adopt a stress-free cooking at home by having the right energy in the kitchen. This includes music, color, measurements, and a sense of humor. She lives in New York City. And we'll begin the show with Carrie Forrest, who represents Bernina Sewing Company. Carrie's going to show us what a double cord presser foot can do and demonstrate how to use it. Carrie's personal business is the Sewing Basket in Clovis, New Mexico. Carrie, thank you so much for coming. I've enjoyed sewing since I was 8 or 9 years old, and I've always been so glad that I did learn to sew. But when I see what you can do with your sewing machine, I just think it should inspire lots of people to want to take up sewing if they don't already.
There is so many things that have come up in the sewing world. Bernina is coming up with constantly new feet that make things a lot easier.
And by feet, what are you talking about?
That is our presser foot that helps make our sewing job a lot easier, so we're not as frustrated as maybe Grandma used to be when she was sewing.
And I wonder how many of your customers come in, and if they're like I am, there's so many features to a sewing machine that we never even learned to use.
You are constantly learning, no matter how long you've been around them, you're constantly learning something new about your machines.
Well, I had not heard of this double cord presser foot. I've heard of a cording foot, or to make piping, but this is different, isn't it?
This one is going to let us work with 2 cords at the same time. It has 2 tunnels on the bottom for our cords to run through. And we do have 2 different sizes. One works with 4 to 6 millimeter cord, and one is 6 to 8 millimeter cord. So you can work with larger cords than some of the other presser feet.
Okay, this will be fun to watch. I've never seen this done. And just so that we can show people, this is called couching?
Couching. Okay. We are attaching a cord to a surface. In this case, we have this pillow.
Here. There's 2 cords here. It's kind of hard to tell. It looks like maybe just one, but there's actually 2 cords.
Yeah, we actually have 2 cords that are sewn on at the same time so that they attach very quickly and easily, and it looks a lot harder than it actually is.
Well, I thought you probably made these and then hand-stitched them or sewed them on. Okay, well, let's, oh, and this is a handle that is actually a double cord as well.
Right. Instead of attaching the cords to a surface, you can actually just stitch them and have a quick and easy handle without any other work.
So these were attached to each other at the same time? Okay, let's see how the magic works.
All right, so I have my 2 cords, and I'm just going to put them under the presser foot. On this background, I have drawn a couple of lines to give me a guide, and I've also stabilized the fabric.
I wondered if it would be important to make it stable.
Because we've got heavy items that are going onto it, if you don't stabilize it, it is going to give us a little puckered look, and we want it to look handmade and not homemade.
That's true. There's a difference.
So we're going to just put these cords under the foot and line everything up with one of the lines we have drawn on the foot. I'm just using a plain zigzag, no fancy stitches.
That's what'll catch the 2.
It's going to catch both of them. So my job is going to be make sure that my stitch is wide enough to actually attach both of them. So I'm going to play with my setting just a little bit here. A little bit wider, and then all I have to do is watch the line on the fabric, and it's going to stitch them right down exactly where I want them to be. We can make that stitch a little bit longer so we can zip our way down. Now, like on our little blue bag, it was the same process, but instead of having a background fabric, we're just stitching the 2 cords with no fabric underneath.
And it helps, I bet, to have you drawn off the lines in just a straight line, but I guess if you were doing a curve or something, you could do that.
Exactly. You can do it freehand. It all depends on the look that you're going for.
That is so pretty.
So that was how we started the pillow, by attaching 2 cords simply by
At one
stitching them
time.
like that. Then you can also use the same foot, and if you wanted to stitch 1 line of cord, we could do that and just put the zigzag where it would go totally over the 1 cord.
to
so
cover it.
you can get several uses from this foot.
And you said we can also do something else. This was called couching, attaching it to the garment.
Right.
And we can also do piping. I think many of us probably are more familiar with piping.
Right. So we have here a little bit thicker piping cord than my regular piping foot's going to hold. So I have those, and we are going to encase them in this fabric. So we're going to take both of them and just wrap the fabric around. This is a 2-step process.
And let's show this, because I didn't realize when I was looking at this is what you're talking about. It'll actually make it look like you've made 2 separate cords.
Right.
But it's all done in one process.
Right. It's a multi-step, but it's one foot that's going to make it all easy. So what I've done is now we have both cords are in the fabric. We're back on a straight stitch.
Oh.
And we're just stitching between the 2 cords at this point. We'll speed that machine up a little bit more. We're just keeping those cords snug in there.
Okay. So that was step 1.
And we have 1 cord nice and tight. Now we're going to take it and wrap it around.
Now, why did you have to have the second one? Did it catch it too?
It may have caught it a little bit, but we need it in there. And now we wrap the cord back, or the fabric back around the cord, and we stitch it again.
Okay. Now, would you attach if you wanted to attach it to something, would you do that at this point? Or is it separate?
It's a separate step, so we need to stitch down, which we'll just stitch a little bit here. And that is enough to give us that idea. Now, you can see where they have stitched together, and we have some extra fabric, so we're going to take and trim the fabric off of the back.
Completely off the back, okay.
So we're just
or down
gonna,
to the stitching line.
Right, we're just going to trim it and leave a small seam allowance.
Okay.
And that is gone. And then you can do the same process, put it back under the foot.
Oh, you'd
stitch
use the
it
same
again.
foot
Very
then.
same. And you get a really nice look with just a little bit of effort on your part, and the foot makes it so much easier.
Oh, it would, because if you did this, the way I learned to make piping was with a zigzag, with a zipper foot.
Exactly, and it would be hard to get 2 cords at the same time. So now we have 2 cords wrapped in 1 fabric. It's real common in upholstery. You see it around chair trims and things like that.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you so much for showing us how easy it is to do that with new machines and with new technology.
It's fun.
Maria, it's such a pleasure to have you here, and I love your accent.
Thank you so much, and I love your accent.
Well,
thank
you.
So it works both ways.
We'll probably both take on each other's traits as we go along. But I really enjoyed reading your cookbook, and it has helpful information. Most cookbooks are cookbooks. They have recipes and maybe a few notes from the chef or notes from the author. But this one deals just as importantly with health issues and avoiding stress. What made you write this book?
Well, it's quite interesting because I was actually guided to write it, because I'm a very spiritual person, and I was guided by God to write this book because I felt it was an important time. There's so many health issues going on out there, and people are looking for alternative solutions to supplement the medication that they're being asked to take by doctors. So I thought it was important to go back, because I looked at my ancient ancestors, and some of them lived, believe it or not, to the age of 150 plus.
Oh, my word.
I know, I was in shock, and I started to ask the question, why was it that the ancient Greeks lived that long? So I read every single book that I possibly could read, and what I've done is consolidated 10 wisdoms that are not only for good health, but longevity and good health. So, and that's how basically I was guided.
Well, and you talk about how to cook adopting the ancient Greek wisdom of agape.
Yes.
Which is love. unconditional love.
But most importantly of all, it's the only word for love in any language that means unconditional love.
Is that right?
Absolutely. And so what that means is no judgment, no conditions, just from a pure place of peace. And I think that that's the most important ingredient in any dish, love.
And in speaking of ingredients, I have to admit I'm one of those people who cooks by recipes. So I go by the measurements. I make very few changes.
Yeah.
I like to cook, but I'm not one that'll just go out and start cooking. And yet you say that we shouldn't worry about if we don't have all the ingredients, just improvise.
Absolutely. Like, you know, today I was making, beautiful carrot soup that we'll discuss later on, and I couldn't find any leeks. So I looked at the next best thing and I thought, well, like I can find, there's some green onions here, I'll just add that. That's, that will work as well. So I wasn't sort of stressing about the fact that I couldn't find leeks or I couldn't find fresh thyme. I went for dry. So I guess what I'm trying to advocate is what my ancient Greek ancestors practiced, and that was stress-free cooking and just going into the kitchen with love and good energy and almost having a dance of cooking. And that's exactly what they did.
Well, you talk about the importance of music and color. How do you incorporate that in your cooking?
Absolutely. I incorporate it in two ways, as did my ancient ancestors. So the first way is to have colour in the kitchen. So, for example, bright colours, create creative thinking and energize. For example, the sun is a type of colour that energizes and helps you think creatively. If we look at the beautiful Santorini blues, which are those light blues, what they tend to do is create peace. So if we look up at the clouds and the sky, we have a sense of peace. So I'm asking people to incorporate colour therapy by way of utensils or colours in their kitchen.
Decorations.
Exactly, to help create the mood. But B, something that we'll discuss a bit more later on, is using colours in our food. And what we're going to discuss later is each colour represents a healing part of the body.
Give some examples of that, would you please?
Absolutely. So, for example, when we're looking at carrots, so orange and yellow colours, they've got a lot of vitamin C, so they're very good, for example, for warding off colds. Not only that, if we cut a carrot and we look at it, it looks like the eye. So therefore the carrots are good for the eye. When we look at a sweet potato, not only does it have the colour, almost the colour of our pancreas, but it is also what we eat for a good healthy pancreas.
Wow,
And
I've
so-
never looked at it in that way.
Yeah, tomato has the colour of the heart. If you cut the tomato in half, it looks exactly like our heart. And that's why tomatoes are good for our heart. So I'm just trying to make people more aware that if we look at each vegetable, it will tell us which part of the body it's good for. So celery looks exactly like our bones. It has the same, almost same composition of sodium as our bones does, and it's good for our bones.
And I've always wondered how people, older people who are probably gone now, but our grandparents and great-grandparents, even here in the States, they lived so much longer and worked so much harder than we do now. And yet I can remember my grandmother never talked about adding too much sodium or salt or cooking, frying foods or things. But they must have known some secrets because of the longevity of that generation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that's really fundamentally changed that I talk about in my book, and the whole notion of using wholesome ingredients. What do I mean by that? Unfortunately, a lot of our foods nowadays have a lot more added chemicals. So that's another really unfortunate thing that that generation did not experience. So I encourage people to, wherever possible, and there are ways that we will discuss later on that people can, buy wholesome at a budget. For example, organic as much as possible. And if you can't afford it, what I do is grow.
Grow your own.
Yeah, I had a small balcony in Sydney, and I grew tomatoes and cucumbers and chilies and herbs. So grow as much as you can. And at least, there are no chemicals on it. And also it has high nutrition when there are no chemicals on it. See, what a lot of people don't realise, the one organic carrot, you have to eat approximately 10 conventional carrots to get the same nutrition.
Oh my word,
That's
quite a difference.
That's the difference of the nutrition.
And even though the organic is usually higher, if you take that comparison, it's not that expensive then.
Exactly, you
Good
eat
point.
less of. And there's more nutrition, so you'll find you'll be fuller quicker as well.
And feeling better, more healthy.
Exactly.
One last point, I want to talk about the kitchen being organized. I like that because
Yeah.
I'm kind of anal that way. But why do you think that's important for us as cooks?
What it does is it keeps the flow of energy going. And because we're in the Greek kitchen, it's all about energy. Energia, energy is an ancient Greek word. And when you're organized and you've prepared everything, so your ingredients are washed and clean, there's a flow of energy that happens. So therefore you're not stressed. You have everything ordered from A to B. So the olive oil will be first, and then you'll put your meat that you'll sort. So have it all in order. And what happens, you cook quicker. As well.
Maybe make less mess.
And make less mess, exactly. I like to sort of clean as I go. So that's very important. Not only that, at that point in time, you realise if you don't have an ingredient. Whereas if you're not organised, I find sometimes in my cooking classes, when I see someone that's not organised, they think, oh my God, I don't have the cinnamon and the clove, and they're running. By the time they run back, half their dish is burnt, or,
Right.
you're likely to have sort of little accidents like that. So organisation keeps the flow of energy going as well.
Well, I had never thought of it that way. I just think it's easier to clean up when you've been organized to start with.
Yeah.
Well, once again, I really enjoyed reading your book, and like I say, it's not just a cookbook. It's a health book, and lots of great tips in it. Thank you so much,
Thank
Maria.
you. Thank you for having me.
Marcy, thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate you coming and bringing your beautiful quilts, some of them anyway. It seems like most quilters have tons of quilts, and but we'll get to see a few of them anyway. But I know you started quilting, per se, when you were 9 years old. Why did you start quilting?
Well, my mom would get swatches of fabric in the mail for a mail order catalog.
I bet it's the same one I used to get.
Yes, and I just loved them, and I collected them, and then I thought, well, I'll make a quilt for my Barbie dolls, and sewed them together, and this is the quilts that I made.
I think that's amazing that you did this when you were just 9 years old.
Yeah, and it got to be a little bit big, so it ended up being the shag rug, which I think you can tell from the polyesters and so forth. I grew up in the 60s and 70s.
I recognize some of these fabrics.
Yeah.
The back, they always say you can tell a quilter's expertise if you look at the back side.
Well, I didn't know quite what the seam allowance was supposed to be, and they're all over the place, but I was sewing lots of different fabrics together and not very skilled at the sewing machine. But I would say this shows that
Anybody can quilt.
Yes.
I like that. I think I have one similar to this somewhere, but this is a nice project.
Yeah, and it's finished because it was the rug.
I see. Yeah, that's why the edges are still
Unfinished.
unfinished, I guess
Yes.
we could say.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
But you certainly went on from here to make beautiful quilts, and I like your concept that we don't need to apologize.
Oh, definitely not.
Probably most people won't notice if we do something wrong, except us.
And we tend to point it out.
I know
and
it.
We don't want to
We don't need to do that.
We don't want to do that.
And you said, how old was the young lady that made this?
She was 26, but this is her first sewing project.
Wow.
First sewing and
This
quilting.
looks kind of complicated to me.
It's very simple. A beginner can do it, and it's cutting triangles out of strips of fabric. And I'm going to point out some, there are some points that don't match, but the design takes care of it.
That's all you see in the beautiful
You see
colors.
the design. You don't see the points that don't match. And I think it's wonderful, and Susan was very proud of having
would be
made this
too.
quilt. Yes.
And of course now, especially from when you were 9 and learned to make your first quilt, there are so many resources, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute, and some are listed in your book.
Yes.
But for this particular one, you've even come up with a triangle.
Yes, this is the Clearview Triangle by Sarah Nephew, and this is the ruler that you used to make that project. It's
And if she had had this then,
well, Susan had it.
oh, she did use it.
Susan did
Good.
use this ruler when she made that quilt, yes.
Okay,
And
60
so,
degrees.
60
All
degree
right.
ruler.
And we decided we would title this segment, Yes, You Can Quilt.
Yes.
And this is the Yes Quilt. Why?
This is Yes Quilt in that I made this quilt, or my son and I made this quilt when he was 7.
7.
And I helped with the rotary cutting and so forth. But every other block is the same fabric, and I rotary cut that. And then he cut the other blocks out with scissors because he can do that at 7. And then we sewed it together. Some of the points match, some of them don't. And it works great. And I would say start with something as simple as this, just squares. See how it goes together, and then and you'll be ready to start the next quilt.
You promise.
I
Yes,
promise.
we can quilt.
Yes, we
Okay.
can quilt.
And speaking of resources, after you got out of college, was it that you took a quilting class?
I took my very first class and learned to quilt by hand, the way my grandmother learned to quilt. And we started with templates, as you can see here. The dots are cut out so we could mark the points where the seams need to intersect. But that's pretty tedious. Then the rotary cutter came out.
Wasn't that great?
It's awesome. And you want to have a mat with that rotary cutter.
You
want to
have
have a good ruler, and definitely want to have a seam ripper.
I
because
have several of those.
it will happen. But I'm going to show you a tip that hopefully will prevent a lot of seam ripping, because your machine's going to work with you.
Well, I know
with
you
the
call,
tips.
or in the instructions you sent to me, you call this a starty-stoppy project, which I thought's what we should name it, because I think your tip is just amazing. And it's so simple, it's like, why hadn't I thought of that?
Yeah, definitely. I learned it after I'd been quilting for about 7 years.
Okay.
And it took a couple of tries because I had an older machine where I had to hand turn to get the needle in the upright position to pull the work out.
Yeah.
And the starty-stoppy removed that motion.
Okay, let's see what a starty is.
Okay. Once I've threaded the machine, the very first thing I do is I put in this scrap of fabric, just
a plain fabric.
Here's a bunch of them that I kind of have off to the side on my machine. And I hold the threads because you need to have tension on that. And then I sew to the front edge.
Just to the edge, no
Just to
back
the
stitch
edge.
or anything.
No, no
Okay.
back stitch. And this is called chain piecing, which quilters do a lot. And I have my blocks ready to sew, and I'm going to sew them together.
And you're using that typical quarter
Quarter-inch seam.
And
Yeah,
the
with quilting.
starty is still on the end.
Yes.
Okay.
And we're just going to chain piece. We're just going to put the next piece in and sew them together. And we'll do a third one real quick.
And we could do 100 of these.
Yeah,
It doesn't
whatever
matter.
you need for your project. And now I'm done, and so now I'm going to sew on to the stoppy.
Which is another piece of quilt
Yes,
fabric.
and
or
it's
any
2
kind.
layers of fabric, just like what I'm sewing.
Oh, I see.
I sew to the front edge, and then I take and I cut my work off. Okay, so here's my work ready to go to the ironing board. And notice how
Kind of
there's
an assembly line process.
Yes, yes. This is the starty. There's nothing at the end. This helps me stay organized because I could come back next month, and sometimes I do get interrupted for that long. I know where the beginning is of my project. I know where the end.
Oh, I see.
I can stay organized with that until I clip them apart and go to the ironing board. And so notice that this stoppy now
Is
is
the
ready.
starty.
It's the
I
starty for
see.
the next project.
But there's also some other good reasons for doing it this way.
Yes.
What are some
well,
of those?
If you noticed, I didn't have to hold those threads like whenever
No.
I did it. Then, and it's less likely that your thread is not going to get jammed up in the machine. You're less likely to have your machine eat the fabric at the beginning because those threads are being held in place. My repair guy said, oh, that's great, because if you have the feed dogs up against the foot, they chew against each other.
Oh.
And the plastic or the metal gets down in the gears, and then you have
Hadn't thought about
wear
that.
happening. So it's a
And also
benefit
you
there.
save on thread, right?
Yes, which
Especially in the bobbin.
yeah. Well, some people
Either
go,
one.
I don't care how much thread I use, but if
Oh.
you don't have to change the bobbin as often, you're going to love your sewing.
That's a lifesaver.
And
It
I've
really
come up
is.
with like a list of 20 different things that you can benefit. So if you can make this part of your habit, you'll love your machine, you'll love your sewing, and your quilting.
And you're not fighting the machine
No.
and spending time unjamming it or whatever.
Right. It's working with you rather than against you.
And what I love, I asked you, what do you do with all these things when you're through? You actually made a little makeup
Yeah, some
bag.
people
or
throw them
little-
away, but I just love them enough that I made a makeup bag out of them just to have some fun with
And
it.
just do a decorative stitch
Yeah.
to attach them.
And you get to use your decorative stitch on your
That's
machine.
right. Well, Marcy, you have some great ideas, and fortunately, you have a book that we might like to even go through and look for instructions, because I think you have shown the instructions so carefully. It would be easy for us to say, yes, I can quilt.
Yes, and Susan's quilt is in that book.
Oh,
Yeah.
wonderful.
So, and a beginner, as you see, can do it. And yes, anyone can quilt.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed the show today. Next time on Creative Living, we'll talk to a designer about the jewelry and handbags she designs. We'll learn to use dominoes for making jewelry and other items, and show how to do t-shirt transfer art. One of my next guests is an artist, designer, and model, and she's created a collection of handcrafted leather purses and jewelry. These items all coordinate with her daughter's clothing designs, which she'll talk about. Another guest who is a designer and crafter will show how to use regular dominoes and a few simple craft products and turn them into jewelry, books, ornaments, and more. And finally, another guest is going to show several dolls wearing t-shirts and other garments that are decorated with transfer art. She'll show us how she uses various transfer sheets for her projects. I hope you'll plan to join me next time for Creative Living.
We are very pleased to offer a special booklet that accompanies this series of Creative Living. We are celebrating our 40th year on PBS. This booklet is titled the 40th Anniversary Series, and it features a wonderful collection of ideas and information, and it's available free of charge on our website. Posted as a PDF file, you can simply download the entire booklet or just the segments you're most interested in. For your copy of this commemorative booklet, go to our website at kenw.org and then click on Creative Living. Scroll down to the booklet section and you can click on this booklet or on any of the other booklets we have available online. We would like to invite you to sign up for our free e-newsletter too. Go to kenw.org and click on the Sign Up Now button and input your email address. That's all there is to it. We would also like to ask you to become a fan of Creative Living on Facebook. Go to facebook.com and in the search window type in Creative Living with Sheryl Borden. Thanks so much. We look forward to hearing from you.